In a stunning royal shakeup, King Charles has officially removed Queen Camilla's family from the royal line of succession, and palace insiders say Camilla broke down in tears. The decision wasn't just protocol, it was personal. And behind it all, a quiet royal who warned them this moment would come. Prince Edward's unseen role within the royal family. For decades, Prince Edward stood in the background of royal life, a silent constant in a family known for chaos, scandal, and spectacle. While Charles navigated controversy, Andrew collapsed under disgrace, and Anne held her ground as the monarch's enforcer. Edward quietly carried the burden of loyalty. He never sought headlines, he never asked for attention, but he was always there. In the early 2000s, when media storms swirled around the firm, Edward quietly stepped away from the public eye. He dedicated himself to the Duke of Edinburgh's award, carrying out his father's legacy with discipline and unwavering focus. While the rest of the family grappled with tabloids and infighting, Edward operated like a shadow, low profile, high purpose. But that didn't mean he was blind to what was happening around him. Insiders have long said that Queen Elizabeth II relied on Edward in ways the public never saw. After Princess Diana's death in 1997, when William and Harry were left emotionally shattered and the monarchy faced its coldest public reception in modern history, it was Edward who mediated tensions behind closed doors. He wasn't flashy, he was steady, and in that steadiness, he became something rare, a truth-teller. When Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles began to dominate the royal narrative in the early 2000s, it was Edward who reportedly expressed concern, not for scandal's sake, but for stability. He feared that the institution was moving too fast to rewrite history, that Diana's legacy was being buried in favor of personal comfort. And yet, his warnings went unheeded. They always did. He was the brother who didn't raise his voice. He made his case in private meetings, in hushed conversations, in memos no one wanted to read. But when Charles ascended the throne in 2022, and Camilla's status was elevated to queen, not consort, not partner, but queen, it became clear to Edward that his voice would never carry weight in the palace that once leaned on him for calm. Still, he stayed loyal. Even as Camilla's family was elevated in press coverage, given roles at public events, and allowed to mingle in spaces once reserved for blood royals, Edward kept his frustration to himself. Until now, because something shifted after Charles's coronation. A decision behind closed doors, a moment too far. When King Charles quietly removed Camilla's children and relatives from the extended royal line of succession, it wasn't just a constitutional adjustment, it was a message. And no one understood that message more than Edward, the man who warned them all, who tried, for decades, to keep the monarchy from overplaying its hand, was watching it happen in real time. And the woman at the center of the storm? He tried warning her too. The woman. He tried to warn Camilla's unstoppable rise. She went from mistress to monarch, from public enemy to palace power. Camilla Parker Bowles has lived through one of the most dramatic transformations in royal history. But behind her rise was a quiet resistance. And at the center of that resistance, Prince Edward. It began long before the 2005 wedding. In the years following Diana's tragic death, the royal family was walking on glass. Public trust was fragile. Emotions were raw, and the memory of the people's princess still dominated every conversation, every column, every public gathering. For Charles to rehabilitate Camilla's image during that time was a bold, and for some, reckless decision. According to insiders, Edward voiced his concerns early. He wasn't cruel, He wasn't confrontational, but he was clear. The wounds were too fresh. The public wasn't ready. And above all, Diana's story, her pain, her compassion, her impact, deserved space to breathe, not be pushed aside. When Charles insisted on pushing forward with the marriage and began exploring Camilla's future title, Edward warned against the optics. The idea of Queen Camilla was, in his view, a mistake. It would create backlash. It would alienate loyalists. It would confirm every fear the public had about the monarchy's indifference. But once again, his voice was lost in the noise of royal ambition. Camilla's rise was steady, strategic, and surrounded by powerful protection. Charles ensured she was photographed doing royal duties, attending events, even appearing alongside Queen Elizabeth herself. The term princess consort began quietly disappearing from the palace language, and the moment the queen passed, the transformation was complete. Camilla wasn't introduced as consort. She was crowned queen. Full stop. Edward's silence that day was deafening. Sources say he watched the coronation not with rage, but with resignation. He had warned them, repeatedly, that pushing Camilla into the spotlight without space for Diana's legacy would fracture the monarchy. And now, the consequences had arrived. When Charles later removed Camilla's family from the official royal line of succession, Camilla reportedly broke down in tears. She had believed the crown had finally made space for her entire world. Not just her title, but her children, her legacy. But Charles's decision was firm, and Edward's silence, this time, spoke louder than ever before. Because beneath the heartbreak, beneath the politics, beneath the crumbling image of royal unity, he had tried to warn her, and she hadn't listened. Diana's ghost still haunts the royal halls. You don't have to say her name, she's still there. Diana. She's in the portraits that were quietly removed. She's in the eyes of her sons when the cameras aren't looking. And for Prince Edward, she's in every corner of the palace where silence has replaced truth. Edward never sought to be Diana's defender. He wasn't part of her inner circle. But in her final years, when the monarchy felt colder than ever, he listened. While others distanced themselves from her out of fear or loyalty to Charles, Edward quietly stood by. And after Diana's death in 1997, when the country cried louder than the crown, Edward saw something most of the firm didn't. The monarchy wasn't being challenged. It was being corrected. Diana brought vulnerability to the institution, emotion, humanity. And in Edward's eyes, that wasn't weakness, it was survival. That's why, when Charles began reworking the monarchy in the wake of Queen Elizabeth's death, Edward reportedly grew uneasy. Behind every modernization, every trimmed-down appearance, every mention of Camilla as queen, he saw one glaring absence: Diana's influence. According to palace insiders, Edward feared the royal family was not just moving forward, but actively rewriting its history. Camilla's increasing prominence, especially in matters of public symbolism, jubilee events, balcony appearances, even sitting where Diana once stood, felt to him like more than evolution. It felt like erasure. He knew what it looked like from the outside. He knew the public had long memories, and that no matter how many years passed, Diana was still the emotional compass of the nation. So when Edward whispered that the family was losing its soul, it wasn't melodrama. It was mourning. Mourning a version of the monarchy that had been more real, more human, and more honest, even if it had been uncomfortable. It's no coincidence that his distance from Charles grew in the years following Camilla's elevation. While others smiled through the narrative, Edward remained stoic, reserved, watchful. He wasn't resisting progress. He was resisting forgetting. And for Camilla, that quiet resistance was a constant reminder. Diana never really left. She just passed her legacy to those who wouldn't let it be rewritten. The Queen's blind spot. A mother's trust in her eldest. Queen Elizabeth II built her reign on restraint, measured words, careful diplomacy, and above all, faith in her family's judgment, especially Charles. No matter how turbulent things became behind palace walls, the Queen stood by her eldest son. Through his rocky marriage, public scandal, and eventual remarriage to Camilla, she rarely interfered. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was her form of control. But for Prince Edward, that silence felt like a blind spot. He had seen the consequences of unchecked power inside the firm. And as Charles began reshaping the monarchy in his own image, Edward warned that the Queen's quiet support might come at a cost. According to royal insiders, Edward raised concerns as early as 2010, when Camilla's public role was expanding rapidly. He questioned whether it was appropriate to allow personal relationships to override public duty, especially with the shadow of Diana still looming so heavily over the monarchy. But he was dismissed. After all, Edward wasn't the heir. He wasn't in the spotlight. He didn't command the same attention Charles did. And perhaps that's why the Queen kept him at arm's length. Not out of distrust, but out of habit. In her world, Edward was dependable, but Charles was the future. And so, even when Edward expressed deep discomfort with the way Camilla was being elevated, when he warned that tradition was being sidestepped in favor of public relations, the Queen said nothing. Sources close to the royal household say she believed keeping the family together mattered more than addressing division. She had seen what public breakdowns looked like. And after Diana, after Andrew, after the Windsor firestorm, she wasn't willing to let another fracture break the crown. But Edward saw something different. He saw the cracks forming beneath the surface. He saw Charles consolidating influence, Camilla gaining symbolic power, and those who disagreed, like himself, being quietly sidelined. He watched as long-standing traditions were rewritten, and loyalty was no longer measured by service, but by silence. After the Queen's passing in 2022, Edward's grief was twofold. He lost his mother, and he lost his last shield inside a palace that was shifting away from everything he believed in. That's why, when Camilla's family was formally removed from the line of succession, and whispers of her tearful reaction leaked to the press, Edward didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. Because to him, the damage had already been done. And the Queen, blinded by love for her firstborn, had allowed it to happen. The Meghan and Harry storm, Edward's second alarm. By the time Meghan Markle entered the royal family, Prince Edward had already learned to read the warning signs. He'd seen what happens when emotion collides with tradition. He'd witnessed the fallout of Diana's struggle, the public's fury, the firm's denial. And when Meghan began making headlines, when she smiled in front of cameras and spoke freely about causes that hadn't yet passed palace approval, Edward felt it in his gut. The cracks were forming again. But this time, no one wanted to listen. Sources close to the family say Edward wasn't concerned about Meghan's background, her nationality, or even her celebrity status. He was concerned about infrastructure, about the lack of preparation, guidance, and boundaries. Meghan was walking into a world where nothing is explained and everything is expected. After the 2018 royal wedding, Edward reportedly raised concerns to Charles and senior aides. His message was simple. They need structure. Without it, they'll feel trapped. But once again, he was overlooked. Charles was focused on public perception, and William, still carrying the scars of the Diana years, was wary of interfering. The palace assumed Meghan would adjust. They expected silence, adaptation, and compliance. Instead, they got headlines. When Meghan and Harry began stepping back from public duties, Edward knew exactly where this was headed. According to insiders, he urged the family to intervene early, to create a clear plan for Meghan's role, to offer mentorship, especially from Sophie. He feared that the couple was being set up to fail by a system that had never truly learned from its past. His fears became reality in January 2020, when Megxit shocked the world. But Edward wasn't surprised. He was frustrated. The pattern had repeated, just as it had with Diana. A woman marries into the family, finds herself isolated, lashes out, and becomes the target. And when the Netflix docuseries dropped in 2022, exposing emotional pain, institutional pressure, and family fractures, Edward didn't watch with curiosity. He watched with confirmation. One source described him as quiet, not angry, just hollow. Because once again, his attempt to preserve the monarchy from itself had failed. He had raised his voice behind closed doors, had warned of the damage being done, not just to Meghan, but to the institution's reputation. His relationship with Harry deteriorated in the aftermath. They rarely speak now. The distance isn't personal, it's philosophical. Edward stands for duty. Harry walks with pain. And somewhere in the middle is the silence of all the things that could have been prevented. And through it all, one person continued to listen. Sophie. The only one who never told him he was overreacting. Sophie Rhys-Jones, the confidant who listened. In a palace where words are weighed and silence is a weapon, Sophie Rhys-Jones became Edward's one true sanctuary. She was never meant to be a royal superstar. She didn't command headlines or court controversy, but behind the scenes, she was Edward's anchor, the only one who truly understood the burden he carried. Unlike Camilla, Sophie didn't enter the royal family surrounded by scandal. She came quietly, walked carefully, and remained steadfast in her loyalty to Queen Elizabeth II. She learned early that the job wasn't about power, it was about presence. And for Edward, that difference mattered. While Charles and Camilla crafted a modern royal love story, Edward and Sophie represented something else: duty without drama. Insiders say Edward confided in Sophie constantly. When he grew frustrated with Camilla's growing influence, when he sensed the monarchy drifting from its moral compass, it was Sophie who listened. No judgment, no agenda, just quiet solidarity. She had her own misgivings too. Though she never said it publicly, Sophie reportedly struggled with Camilla's sudden elevation to queen. Not because of jealousy, but because it violated every unspoken rule the late queen had tried to uphold. In private, Sophie and Kate Middleton developed a close bond. Their quiet support for each other contrasted sharply with the stormier dynamics of the wider family. They never sought center stage, but their grace in the background became its own kind of strength. To Edward, that was the future of the monarchy. Not performative, not political, just genuine. And when Edward's fears about Meghan, Harry, Camilla, and even Charles went ignored, it was Sophie who kept him grounded. She reminded him why he spoke up, even when no one listened. She reminded him that loyalty isn't measured in silence, it's measured in honesty. The two of them remained scandal-free for decades, not because they were passive, but because they chose principle over positioning. But that choice came at a cost. Edward was often left out of key decisions. His opinions, though proven right again and again, were pushed aside. And Sophie, despite being one of the monarchy's most stable assets, was often overshadowed. But none of that mattered in their home. Because when Edward muttered, "I tried warning her," he didn't need to explain it. Sophie already knew. She always had. The Andrew Scandal. Edward's growing frustration. If there was ever a moment that shook Edward's faith in the royal family's judgment, it was the Andrew Scandal. When Prince Andrew's ties to Jeffrey Epstein exploded into global headlines in 2019, the palace found itself trapped in a new kind of crisis, one that couldn't be controlled with silence or photo ops. And while others panicked, Edward responded with urgency. He wasn't shocked by the allegations, he was horrified by how slow the crown was to react. Insiders say Edward was one of the first royals to demand that Andrew be removed from public duties. He called it a matter of credibility, not just for the firm, but for the monarchy's relationship with the next generation. "We can't be the symbol of tradition and protect this," he reportedly told senior aides. But once again, his warnings were met with hesitation. Queen Elizabeth, always cautious in the face of scandal, held off. Charles reportedly feared that moving too quickly would create a media frenzy, but Edward disagreed. He believed the longer they waited, the more damaging it would be. He was right. By the time Andrew was officially stripped of his titles and removed from the public eye, the damage was already done. And to Edward, it was another devastating example of the monarchy refusing to act until it had no choice. What frustrated him most wasn't just Andrew's actions, it was the culture that allowed it. The lack of accountability, the insistence on protecting image at all costs. He had seen it happen with Diana. He had seen it happen with Meghan and Harry. And now it was happening again, with even darker consequences. According to royal insiders, Edward quietly began pushing for a smaller, more merit-based royal family, one built on service, not entitlement. But his suggestions were ignored, again. To many, Edward's absence from key appearances in 2020 and 2021 was just scheduling. But those close to him knew better. He was pulling back, still loyal, still present, but no longer convinced that the institution was willing to learn. And with each silent warning dismissed, Edward felt something shift inside. Not bitterness, not rebellion, just disappointment. The kind that runs deep, especially when you've given your life to something that won't listen. The title, Tug of War. Edward's delayed dukedom. For years, it was considered a done deal. When Prince Philip passed away in 2021, it was widely expected that Prince Edward would inherit his father's title, Duke of Edinburgh. The announcement had even been made back in 1999, with Queen Elizabeth's blessing. The public saw it as symbolic, a way of honoring Edward's decades of quiet service and deep commitment to the Duke of Edinburgh's award. But after Philip's death, nothing happened. No announcement, no official ceremony, just silence. And Edward, once again, was left waiting. According to sources within the palace, the delay wasn't administrative, it was personal. Rumors swirled that Charles had chosen to review the matter privately. Some believed he wanted to slim down the monarchy's titles. Others believed it was retaliation, a quiet response to Edward's disapproval of Camilla's rise and his repeated questioning of the crown's direction. Either way, it was a painful blow. Edward never asked for power. He never fought for spotlight. But he had always been loyal, and he had always played by the rules. To be passed over, or worse, paused, after decades of quiet service felt like a betrayal. Insiders say he was deeply hurt, though he never said a word publicly. Sophie, ever his confidant, was more visibly frustrated. She reportedly told close friends the delay was unnecessary and unkind. Public pressure began to build. Royal commentators called the decision puzzling, and the media began to ask questions the palace didn't want to answer. Why hadn't Edward received the title? What was the holdup? Finally, in March 2023, the palace relented. Edward was officially granted the title Duke of Edinburgh. But by then, something had changed. The gesture didn't feel like recognition. It felt like a correction. To Edward, the delay had become a symbol of how, in this new version of the monarchy, loyalty wasn't rewarded. It was managed. He hadn't rebelled. He hadn't leaked stories. He hadn't demanded headlines. And still, he was sidelined. Not for scandal, but for speaking the truth when it was inconvenient. That title, once seen as an honor, now carried a bitter weight. Not because Edward didn't value it, but because he knew what it cost him to finally receive it. And he wasn't sure it had been worth the wait. Charles's coronation and the final breaking point. On 6 May 2023, the eyes of the world turned to Westminster Abbey. The coronation of King Charles III was meant to be a triumph, a grand passing of the torch. But for Prince Edward, it was the day everything truly changed. He stood in full regalia, present but distant. Unlike William, who played his expected role as heir, and Camilla, who beamed beneath her newly placed crown, Edward's expression never wavered. Stoic, unreadable. But to those who knew him well, the silence was screaming. Inside the abbey, royal watchers noted the tension. Edward did not take part in key private briefings ahead of the ceremony. He declined involvement in discussions about Camilla's final styling as Queen, and reportedly skipped closed-door strategy sessions that focused on public perception rather than family unity. One courtier revealed, Edward felt the whole thing had drifted too far from the values the Queen held. It had become a performance, not a legacy. In the weeks leading up to the coronation, Edward had hoped Charles might reconsider some of the more symbolically loaded decisions, including Camilla's family's roles within the royal inner circle. When those hopes were ignored, he reportedly made a quiet but decisive move. He stopped fighting, and that, in many ways, was more damning than any public outburst. At the coronation, Edward didn't rebel. He didn't step out of line. But his emotional distance was impossible to miss. He kept to the edges, avoided the cameras, and never once looked directly at Camilla during the crowning moment. That, more than anything, told the story. This wasn't the brother who had spent decades upholding tradition. This was the man who had finally given up trying to fix something that refused to be fixed. Behind the palace walls, whispers grew louder. Some aides feared Edward would go public. Others suspected he was already doing so, through quiet channels, sharing his thoughts with trusted journalists, passing along memos that showed how often he had tried to steer the family toward caution. In 2024, a leaked internal memo confirmed what many suspected. Edward had warned Charles repeatedly about elevating Camilla too far, too fast. And by then, it was too late. The crown had been placed. But the trust, within the family and beyond, had already begun to fracture. The warning echoes, public reaction, and what comes next. In the months after the coronation, something shifted. Prince Edward, long dismissed as the quiet royal, was being re-evaluated as the one who saw it coming. It started with whispers, then hashtags like #Edward was right. Leaked memos revealed he had warned about Camilla's rise, Meghan and Harry's alienation, and Andrew's scandal, all before they exploded. Suddenly, Edward's absence from key events looked less like distance and more like protest. Clips from past interviews resurfaced, old photos, forgotten quotes, and people listened differently this time. Even political voices chimed in. Edward may be the only royal who didn't act for himself. That's why they ignored him. Inside the palace, Charles grew uneasy. Edward wasn't just right. He was becoming a symbol of conscience. Camilla, devastated by her family's quiet removal from the succession line, reportedly broke down behind closed doors. Her fear wasn't about status, but about losing public support. And Edward? He stayed silent. Not to win, but because he'd said it all before. He hadn't wanted power. He only wanted to protect the crown from itself. Now, as trust in the monarchy hangs by a thread, the world is finally listening. Camilla's rise once seemed unstoppable, but now her family's erasure from the royal line marks a turning point. Charles acted. Camilla wept. Edward was right. As the monarchy faces its next chapter, one thing is clear: the past can't be ignored forever. And those who tried to warn them, they're finally heard.